Bill Blair is Canada's Minister of Border Security and Organised Crime Reduction. As we know, he's been spearheading a lot of the government's legislation, both on legalizing cannabis and on changes to alcohol impairment rules and what rules police will now be able to follow. So, Bill Blair, good to see you. What will change December 18th in terms of police powers when it comes to dealing with impaired drivers?
It's really important that all Canadian drivers understand that as of December 18th, the police will be able to make a demand, and it's a mandatory test for a person to submit, a person who's been operating a motor vehicle, to submit to mandatory alcohol screening. It's a roadside device. They blow into a straw. The device will give them either a fail or a pass warn or a fail reading, and people are now required to submit to that test. The way it has worked up until now, and up until December 17th, the police required reasonable suspicion. So if they're out on a spot check and they pull the driver over, if the person admitted that they'd been drinking or the officer smelt alcohol, they could form reasonable suspicion that the driver's been drinking and administer the test. But a lot of people had figured out how to bluff their way through that, Peter. And so what we have in this new legislation is that the police will be able to make a mandatory demand that the drivers submit. It only takes a few seconds. And I think this is a game changer. In every jurisdiction where they've done this, it saves lives. But it's really important the Canadian drivers know that what their responsibilities are.
So to be clear, and maybe the best way to test this is to provide maybe an example. So if you're driving along and you might have a broken tail light, or you might have made an illegal stop, sure, and turned whatever. If the police stop you for that reason, I'm pulling you over because you've got a broken tail light, and do they need to then suspect the person might have also been drinking, or can they just say, I pulled you over for a broken tail light, and now, even though I don't see any evidence of it, I'm also going to ask you to take this mandatory breath test?
The stop has to be lawful. That's right in the legislation. The stop has to be lawful, which means the police
can't just pull over somebody for no reason.
The police must have a lawful authority to pull that car over. Now, in our laws, we allow the police, as this was determined by the Supreme Court, that it was tested many years ago, and the police have the ability to set up these spot checks you see on the highway, where the lights are flashing, right, and every car,
where they're stopping everybody.
Every car gets pulled over. That's a random stop, and that's a lawfully authorized stop. But in every other case, the police have to have a legal authority, and that's either through the Highway Traffic Act or through some other statute to make a lawful stop. And if they do that, they also have now the ability to demand, if they have the device with them, by the way, they can't send for the device. If they've got it with them, they can make a demand.
That's important.
It is important.
Right.
So we don't want this to be overly intrusive. We want to be able to, ensure our roadways are safe, ensure the sobriety of drivers, and at the same time do it in a way which does not unduly infringe upon people's rights to be on their way.
But I guess the gray area for a lot of people and the police will presumably know this, and it may fall into the lap of Crown prosecutors at some point, but police know what will define a lawful stop. I mean, presumably, and as the example I've given you, one of them, if you're pulled over for whatever reason,
yes, it is,
that qualifies as a lawful stop, you can be administered a breath test.
Yes, if the police have pulled you over lawfully, and certainly a broken taillight, right, somebody going through a stop sign, speeding exam, are all reasons for a lawful stop of the driver. You get to determine whether the driver's licensed, so you can have the authority to ask for the driver to identify themselves by producing a license, and they have the authority to determine if the person is sober. And now they have the ability to demand that people to submit to a test for a roadside screening device. And quite frankly, for an awful lot of Canadian drivers, it's the prospect of getting caught, which is the greatest deterrent. And as of December 18th, the likelihood of getting caught is about to increase significantly. You're not going to be able to bluff your way through these roadside stops.
Do you have any idea how much more significantly it will rise? So presumably, if I understand this correctly, every single time a police officer makes a lawful stop, there is the potential for a breathalyzer test.
If they have the device with them, yes. And they're not going to do it every single time, but the police have an important job to do, and making sure that drivers are sober and safe is one of those important jobs, and they now have the authority to do that, where it was more difficult from in the past when people, if the person didn't admit to their drinking or the officer didn't smell the alcohol on them, and people can chew mints and gum and things like that to mask that. The police officer can now make that demand. They're not going to make that demand in every case, but they can. And it's really important that drivers understand when they're making the decision on how they're going to get home. If they're going to go out and they're going to drink, don't drive. And if you're making the choice to drive, you better have an understanding that the police ability to detect that and prosecute it should you commit a crime is about to significantly improve. And so it's an important new authority for the police, and the sole purpose behind this is saving lives. And you asked about the proportion of the impact on this thing. In other jurisdictions where they've implemented this, they've seen about a 20-25% reduction in impaired crashes and impaired death. And in Canada, that means about 200 people will not be killed on our highways with the implementation of this new law. It's going to save 200 lives and literally 1,000, about 12,000 a year, people who are seriously injured in these crashes. And so that has lifelong consequences for those individuals. I've had the job of knocking on people's doors to tell them that a loved one has died. On average today, almost 4 Canadians die as a result of somebody's criminal decision to drive while impaired. And if we can eliminate 25% of that, that's going to be a significant improvement.
Let me there's no doubt, lawyers have already suggested it'll be challenged in court. You think you've got legislation here that'll stand that test?
Yeah, absolutely. Impaired driving is the most litigated law. It is the job of criminal lawyers who defend impaired drivers to challenge these laws. But, we have a chartered opinion from the Attorney General. We've also sought legal opinions from some of the most respected constitutional authorities in the country. It was tested and discussed at great length in both the Senate and the House. I'm very confident that the ability of these new regulations and new laws to save lives saves this under Section 1 of our Charter and will be determined to be constitutional.
Well, I've got you here. Let me ask you about another key issue sort of in your lap, and that's the asylum seekers at the border. Auditor General last week pointing out the cost of those arrivals to the federal government, some $340 million this year, up to $400 million next year. It's causing a backload at the Immigration Review Board that'll take years to clear, according to the AG. You've put aside $175 million a year over 2 years. To deal with this, the rising costs. Clearly not enough. What's the plan to get this under control?
I'll tell you, we're working very hard on the plan. And first of all, I think there are important things that we can and must do to discourage people from crossing irregularly and encourage them to use the proper system at a point of entry. We also have to ensure that the processes for determining their eligibility for asylum in this country are quicker and more efficient and less costly. And so we've been working on making significant improvements in that.
So you acknowledge you've got a problem here, that this is ballooning into something bigger than you expected?
No, Peter, quite honestly, since 2017, we've seen a significant increase in the number of people seeking asylum around the world. And certainly Canada is impacted like every other First Nation or first world country in the world is experiencing significant challenges with this migration of people fleeing persecution. And Canada is not immune to that. And so people are presenting themselves at our borders. We have to make sure that our systems, first of all, are fair, that we uphold Canadian law, that we also ensure that if a person is determined eligible, we move through that quickly as possible. But if they're ineligible, they're subsequently removed from the country.
You're working to streamline that process.
Yeah, of course.
You've also been in ongoing discussions with the United States, your counterpart there, in terms of reforming the Safe Third Country Agreement to make it more effective at reducing that flow of people. How's that going?
Yes, one of the reasons that people are presenting themselves irregularly is to avoid the consequences of the Safe Third Country Agreement. And so we have undertaken discussions with my U.S. counterpart, the Secretary of Homeland Security. I've gone down and spoken to their officials about our desire to enhance and improve that agreement. I think there are opportunities there to make that far more effective for both of our countries.
Are you close to getting any kind of an agreement, any kind of?
Well, it's a work in progress, and I don't want to sort of get ahead of those discussions, but we acknowledge and recognize how important it is. We've made that very clear to our colleagues in the United States. This is a bilateral agreement. We can't just, as some have suggested, unilaterally decide to change the terms and conditions. It's got to be worked out. This has been the law between us, an agreement between us since 2004. We recognize that there are ways in which it needs to be improved, and we have already undertaken with the United States to seek those improvements.
All right, Bill Blair, always good to talk to you. Thanks again.
Thank you, Peter.